Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Shorts episode number 30. The other Melville, the Bushranger. George S Melville, nicknamed Frenchy, was born in about 1815 in Scotland. He was convicted at the Glasgow Court of Justiciary for a term of 14 years transportation. He was a groom and coachman at the time of his conviction and was 20 years old based on his convict muster information. He departed in June 1836 on the Lady Kennaway and arrived in New South Wales in October 1836. On the 8th of December 1838, he was sent to Newcastle, New South Wales, to be incarcerated there. On the 29th of December 1843, he was in the Iron Gang and Road Party at Woolloomooloo. In July 1844, he ran away from the boat crew. He was tried at Hyde Park Barracks and sentenced to 12 months' imprisonment in irons at Norfolk Island. He was then sent to Tasmania, where he served time as a convict. He received his ticket of leave on the 20th of June 1846 in Yass, New South Wales. He married Alphonsine Josephine Euphrosyne Barbalet in Victoria in 1852. Alphonsine was born in Mauritius in 1825 to Julian Barbalet and Louise Tarby. Her parents were French and she had an older brother, Louis. Her father was an enslaver in Mauritius in 1826 and 1830. Alphonsine was only 5 when her father died. Her mother remarried in Mauritius on the 20th of September 1830, in the year her husband died, to Castor Edmond Denis de Cotter. Her mother died in June 1854 in Mauritius, aged only 48. Alphonsine gave birth to a daughter at Port Louis at Mauritius in 1843 when she was 18. This child was named Louise Selvener Barbalet. Alphonsine arrived on the 1st of November 1848 at Port Phillip Bay on the Skern. On the 10th of November 1848, in the Sydney Daily News and Evening Chronicle, it announced the arrivals at Port Phillip and said 1st of November, Skern, a brig of 120 tonne, from Mauritius on the 7th of September. Passengers, Mr. and Mrs. McLaurin and Mr. Barbalet. Mr. and Mrs. McLaurin were in fact Alphonsine and John McLaurin. There is a record of her marrying John McLaurin in Victoria in 1852. So whether they were already married at Mauritius or just went by Mr. and Mrs. for the voyage out to Australia, and I'm assuming Mr. Barbalet is her brother Louis. John McLaurin was Scottish and he died on the 20th of November 1852. He was only 22 at Woori Wairite, Mount Shadwell, near Terang in Victoria. The only thing I can find of him for his short time in Australia was on the 26th of November 1852 in the Melbourne Argus, where it announced his death, saying suddenly, at Woolwich on Saturday the 20th, John, only son of D. McLaurin, Esquire. Louis was recorded of being in Launceston, Tasmania, and then sailed to Geelong, Victoria on the 18th of December 1853 when he was 25. Lewis married Agnes Welsh in Melbourne in 1854. They had 3 children, but only one survived childhood. He died on the 14th of April 1859 in Geelong, aged only 35, and when his only surviving child was 2. Agnes remarried to a Mr. Williams, but Agnes died when their only surviving child was 10. So Lewis and Agnes's son, Joseph Alexander, was born in 1857. As a result of his mother's death, he became a state ward. He married and moved to Western Australia, and he altered his surname from Barbalet to Barbalet. After John McLaurin's death, Alphonsine then married George Melville on the 19th of July 1852 at St James's when she was 27 and George 32. They kept a fruit and oyster shop in Little Burke Street, and it was said to have been John McLaurin's business that Alphonsine then inherited. Then 12 months after their marriage, in July 1853, a band of desperate bushrangers huddled beside dim lights on the Heathcote goldfields and planned a daring robbery. Most of the gold they stole was never found. According to legends, the treasure is still believed to be buried in the scrub near Heathcote, which was known as McIvor at the time. The gang of bushrangers included the following: George Frenchy Melville, William Atkins, another ex-convict, aged 28, George Wilson, aged 32, John and Joseph Francis, who used the alias of John and Jeremiah Murphy, Joe Gray, alias Nutty, Bob Harding, Ned McIvor, George Elson, and a man named Billy. Their plan was to rob the gold escort that was delivering the takings from the McIvor Diggings. The Melbourne Gold Escort Company dray was driven by Thomas Flukes, and it pulled out of McIvor carrying 2,223 ounces of gold and £700 in notes, all up worth £10,000. He was heading for Kyneton, where it would join up with the government gold escort and continue to Melbourne. He was accompanied by 5 men on horseback, the man in charge, Mr. Warner, 3 company employees, and a police sergeant. The coach had travelled about 20 miles from McIvor when they came across a big log thrown across the road and what at first appeared to be an Aboriginal mea, that is, a small hut, next to it. As the driver attempted to drive his team around the log, a large volley of shots rang out from the shelter. Flukes was fatally wounded, and its escort soon gave up any attempt to fight back and retreated, leaving the dray to be plundered of its contents. The robbery was the largest ever known at that time. A huge manhunt was soon underway to find the culprits. John Francis and George Wilson were soon arrested, along with their wives, aboard the Madagascar in Hobson's Bay. Shortly after, George Melville and his wife were arrested on board the barque Collooney, heading for Mauritius, while William Atkins and his wife had booked their passages on the Hellespont and were discovered in a boarding house in Melbourne. George Francis was arrested, and he offered to give evidence against all of the bushrangers in return for freedom for himself and his brother. On the 23rd of August 1853, George Francis committed suicide by cutting his throat with a razor on the way back to Melbourne. His brother John turned Queen evidence or informer. From the court case, it says that Mr. James Utley was sworn in. He says, from information I received, I proceeded, accompanied by Detectives Murray and Simcott, on the 11th of August on board the barque Collooney, then lying in Hobson's Bay, and from further information I there received, I made a search in one of the cabins where I found a leather trunk which I opened. It contained 2 parcels of sovereigns. One was a small leather bag containing £403, 10 shillings in gold. The other was a sort of reticule that contained 720 sovereigns. Amongst other things in the trunk, I found several papers and receipts bearing the name of George Melville. I took possession of the property and left the vessel. I then had the parties removed to the lockup. At 8 o'clock the same evening, I went to the same 2 officers and Francis to the North Star Hotel, where I arrested George Melville. I told him the nature of my charge against him, and on searching found on him £100 and 10 shillings in gold, silver and notes, a silver watch and guard, a 6-barrelled revolver and an American gold dollar. I also confined him to the watch house. When George Francis turned informant, he said that he'd known George Melville from Van Diemen's Land. And he went on to say, Melville was not at my house. The last time I saw him was on board the Collooney, and he said he was going to Mauritius. The Collooney was a ship in Hobson's Bay and bound for Mauritius. I went ashore, but on our way we stopped at the Collooney and I saw Melville and told him to take care of my wife, whom we put aboard that vessel. I remained in custody until that time. Melville told me he'd disposed of his gold, but he did not say to whom. From those captured, the authorities recovered £2,500 in gold, banknotes, sovereigns and bank drafts, and 7 bags of gold. The bulk of the gold was never discovered, as the rest of the felons were never apprehended. And in the court case, towards the end with their decision, it says the announcement of the verdict had considerable effect on Melville, who became suddenly pale and frequently drew his hand over his forehead as if in the deepest state of mental agony. He soon recovered himself, however, and was talking with a smile on his countenance to someone who stood immediately below the dock. Upon the verdict being delivered, agonised sobs from that quarter broke upon the awful silence of the court, and for a moment Melville turned his eyes upwards, the working of his muscles of his face telling how deep his feelings were. The prisoner Melville then addressed the court, after the prisoners were asked if they had anything to say. He said he was in the most peculiar and painful position that ever any human being was. He wished to remark upon the evidence for the Crown. He did not know whether he was at liberty to make any remarks upon that evidence. His Honour said that such observations would be out of place addressed to him, and that his judgment could only be founded upon the verdict of the jury. Melville continued his address by remarking that he was a persecuted man. There were several facts and important particulars sworn falsely to by several witnesses. He wished to speak his mind upon the subject. This was the last time he would have an opportunity of speaking, and he wished the truth to be known. His Honour remarked that the verdict was now given, and it was useless to appeal to the court for any avoidance of consequences. Melville said that His Honour mistook his meaning. He did not appeal to him for mercy. He would appeal for mercy to another court, where judges themselves shall be judged, where nobles and kings and all men will be tried. He wanted no mercy. He rather hoped to be soon placed at that judgment seat where he trusted he should be found more spotless than the verdict of the jury would allow him to appear in the eyes of the world. He had not been permitted to speak. He did not say this with any wish to dissuade his counsel. He was grateful for them for the able defence they had made for him, but if he defended himself, he felt that the verdict of the jury would have been very different, and he should have now been a free man. He would not wish any remission of the sentence which was in the power of the court to pass. He knew that he was condemned, and also knew that sentence of death would be passed upon him. He was going to death on the lies of that bloodthirsty Francis, and he wished that the vengeance of heaven would fall upon him. But there were more men equally to blame. There was another man in a high and responsible situation with whom all this evidence for the Crown had commenced. He had no wish to mention him. It was of no use now. He was quite prepared for his sentence, and he had nothing more to say. The prisoner's address was spoken in a firm tone of voice, and his manner was perfectly collected. He spoke fluently, freely, and well. He shed tears in the course of his remarks, and altogether conducted himself with calmness and self-possession. The learned judge then proceeded to pass sentence and said, addressing the prisoners, that after a protracted trial of 10 hours, during which the jury closely and diligently attended to all the evidence, they had found the prisoners guilty. Their counsel had done all in their power for them, all in fact that mortals could do. They had had the advantage of all the ability and zeal of those learned counsel, but the facts of the case were too clear for these to avail them. The crime of which they, the prisoners, had been convicted, the robbery of the escort, was a bold undertaking, boldly undertaken and well nigh successful. His Honour was glad to see that at least one of them felt that there was a higher power than this court, because it was to that higher tribunal that their appeals must now be made. Their plan was well nigh successful. Several of them had got on board ships. Some were going to Mauritius, some to Sydney, some to England, where they intended to have enjoyed the gains derived from this robbery. But it was decreed otherwise. They left wounded on the field 2 witnesses, Davis and Morton, the latter almost dead. These witnesses appeared in evidence against them, and although with reluctance of honest, high-minded men, they refused to swear positively to the identity of the prisoners, yet their belief was as clear and convincing as if they actually swore absolutely to them. The learned judge then expressed his own belief to be in accordance with the verdict. Although he abhorred the accomplice, yet here the story of Francis was so clear when in the witness box that though he felt a natural abhorrence of the man who turns up his fellows in crime, he felt that he told the truth. There was no sympathy in such friendship as they, the prisoners and the approver, had contracted, and had no doubt that the prisoners must feel themselves most fully. His duty was not a pleasant duty, but it might be that their unhappy fate would warn others pursuing the same path of crime. He hoped it would. He could hold out no hopes of mercy. He trusted that they would endeavour to meet their fate in a suitable frame of mind, and that they would banish every vindictive feeling against Francis from their breasts. The prisoner Melville, he said, "May God Almighty forgive me as freely as I forgive Francis." His Honour was glad to hear such an expression of feeling, and it was undoubtedly proper. The bonds of crime were not like the firmly cemented unions of honourable friendship. Worthless they were, and weak and deceitful. The present was sliding away from them, and their thoughts ought now to be devoted to the hereafter. The learned judge, who was much affected during his address, then proceeded to pass sentence in the usual form, remarking that although his duty as a judge would prevent his exhibiting his feelings as a man, yet it was not because he did not feel as a man for their most awful position. The sentence of death was passed upon the prisoners, and they were removed from the bar. So the 3 escort robbers, George Melville, William Atkins and George Wilson, were convicted and sentenced to die. John Francis, who turned Queen's evidence after his brother's suicide, proves to have been the captain of the gang, verifying the old adage, the bigger the rogue, the better the luck. John Francis and his wife were given a free passage out of the colony, and the three men were hanged on Monday the 3rd of October 1853, on the 8th of October 1853 in the Hobart Courier from Melbourne. Execution of the private escort robbers. Yesterday morning at 8 o'clock, George Melville, George Wilson and William Atkins were executed in the accustomed manner for taking part in the murderous attack on the private gold escort. The wretched men slept soundly for some hours on Sunday night, waking between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, dressed themselves with some attention to outward appearance. Each of them wore clean linen and was scrupulously neat. At the early hour, Reverend Stoddart, the ordinary of the jail, arrived, and from that moment the men were engaged in religious exercises. At 8 o'clock, the High Sheriff went to the cell to announce that the hour had arrived. Melville was the first to leave the cell. He was dressed in a black surtout coat, white waistcoat and trousers. He appeared very pale and nervous, and his countenance showed that his mind was fearfully at work. Melville appeared to be engaged in prayers. As the melancholy procession emerged from the jail into the prison yard, Melville recognised an eminent barrister present and nodded to him. They reached the scaffold. Melville began to speak, but affecting to believe that the people were too far off to hear him, he stopped short after saying he could not make himself heard and wished them all a very good morning. There was a considerable crowd of spectators, the largest we believe ever present at an execution here. The executioner placed the ropes around their necks, fixed the men in their relative positions, and having drawn the caps over their eyes, the hangman descended the stairs to draw the fatal bolt. This was done, and the men fell, convulsed with the throes of the death struggle. Melville's body was applied for by his wife and given up to her. And on the 7th of October 1853 in the Melbourne Banner, the executed culprit, the deceased malefactor George Melville, on passing along the condemned cell to the scaffold on Monday morning, begged Mr. Wintle, the governor of the jail, to gratify his last wish on earth by promise that he would cause publicity to be given through the newspaper press to a written document which the wretched man had prepared from the hour of his condemnation, as the contents attack, in somewhat unmeasured language, the official character of some or other in local authority. Melville, observing Mr. Ireland near, nodded to him, but that gentleman turned away, too much affected and repulsed by the awful event. One matter we desire to call the attention of the government to, and it is this. The corpse of Melville was given to his widow and was opened for inspection in Little Bourke Street during the day of the execution. The coffin was furnished by the friends of the deceased and received religious interment. Alphonsine had placed her husband's corpse in the window of their oyster shop in order to condemn the police and protest against her husband's treatment at the hands of the law. She charged money for spectators to hear her grievances against the police and the government. She had lovingly decorated the coffin and him with ribbons and flowers. The spectacle was short-lived. The police heard of Mrs. Melville's antics and swiftly had the body returned to Melbourne Jail, where he was buried alongside other executed criminals. This would be the last time in Melbourne that such a display would be allowed. It led to a change of law in Victoria, preventing any other families from claiming their loved ones' bodies. All bodies of executed individuals from that time on were buried in the old Melbourne Jail grounds. George Melville's story is told at the old Melbourne Jail. What happened to Alphonsine? Well, she went on to marry another Scotsman, Alexander MacLeod, on the 26th of December 1853 in Melbourne, when she was 28 and Alexander 31, within 2 months of her husband's execution. They had 3 children together, with 2 of them surviving infancy: Alexander Jr., who was born in 1854, Louisa Allen, who was born in Darlinghurst, New South Wales in February 1856, who died at 11 months, and Mary Josephine, who was born in South Yarra, Victoria in January 1858. Alexander MacLeod had been born in New South Wales. He was a gardener and a victualler, and he died in 1860 in New South Wales. Her daughter Mary and her second husband moved to Echuca, and that is because that is where Alphonsine was living with her 4th husband, who was Samuel Beaton. He was a miner, and they married on the 22nd of February 1867 in Daylesford, Victoria. She was 42 and Samuel 39 when they married. They already had a son, Samuel Neil Beaton, who had been born on the 1st of August 1863 at Bungaree near Ballarat in Victoria. Alphonsine died on the 22nd of March 1884 in Victoria at the age of 59 under her second name Josephine, and she's buried in the Moama Cemetery. On the 19th of January 1900, in the Melbourne Age, of the estate of Josephine Beaton, late of Echuca, Victoria, married woman, deceased interstate, may be granted to Samuel Beaton of Echuca North, contractor, being the widow of the deceased. Now, I have no idea why it took 16 years for her husband to be able to claim her probate. Samuel is recorded as living with their son, Samuel Neil Beaton, in Goulburn Road, Echuca, in 1908. Samuel and Alphonsine's son, Samuel Neil Beaton, died in Echuca in 1910 at the age of only 46, and he did not marry. And then her husband, Samuel Beaton, died not long after, on the 13th of February 1911. In the Echuca Riverine Herald, it says, a very old resident of Echuca, Mr. Samuel Beaton, passed away yesterday. He'd been in this town and an immediate neighbourhood for 35 years. He was a well-known and highly esteemed member of the Salvation Army, which he'd been associated with for 17 years. The deceased was at one time a casual employee of the local council and constructed several of the channels in the main streets. For the last 20 years, he was a holder of a block of land at the village settlement. Until a year or two ago, he resided with his son. His son, Mr. Neil Beaton, died about 7 months ago. The deceased gentleman, who'd been feeble for a long time, was 83 years of age.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.